The next speaker will be Senator Scullion, and as this will be his first speech, I would ask that the usual courtesies be extended to him. Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Madam President. I second the motion. Madam President, I have been honoured by the Northern Territory community in being elected to represent their interests in the Senate. I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of this land, and to thank one of the elders of the Ngunnawal people, Matilda House, for her welcome last week and her presence in the gallery today. As the Country Liberal Party Senator in this chamber, I'll be continuing the great work of Bernie Kilgariff and Grant Tambling. Both of these dedicated Territorians have contributed have made a vital contribution to the life of all Australians. My thanks to everyone who encouraged and supported my endeavour to represent Territorians' interests in Canberra. The Country Liberal Party and the people of the Northern Territory offered a wonderful level of support. Thank you. In 1985, when I arrived with Jenny in the Northern Territory, I knew that our search for a home and a place to start a family was over. You've never seen such a place. On the journey north to Alice Springs, through the Red Centre, you can't help but be impressed with the magnificent harshness of the desert country, but also with the Centralians who have built such a splendid town and a vibrant tourist industry with products that rank amongst the finest in the world. Arguably, Australia's finest and most comprehensive advertising campaign is being conducted by the Arunta Desert people. Whenever you travel in the world, you will see images of Central Australia depicted in the unique art of dot paintings. All Australians, particularly those involved in the tourist sector, have benefited significantly from the efforts of those hard-working Territorians. Darwin has to be the true cosmopolitan capital of the world. We have people from half the nations in the world represented in our population, and the other half wants to move there. The friendliest place in the world, the kind of place you can leave the airport, jump in a cab, drive to one of our many watering holes and sit down and have a beer. Within an hour, you'll be sharing a table with a whole range of new mates. It's just that sort of place. So I had this vision of sitting on a vessel, surrounded by perfect balmy weather, swaying palm trees, catching barramundi and getting paid for it. I thought that seems to be a great way of life, a professional fisherman. That's the life for me, I thought. Well, the vision was soon shattered. As anyone who's made a living from the sea will attest, success is usually about very hard work, a few tears and a fair bit of luck. There were pretty significant downsides to living off northeast Arnhem Land: the harshness of the environment, the unforgiving nature of the sea. Challenges range from the unpredictable, like being grovelled by a wounded buffalo in an attempt to put some meat into an otherwise all-seafood diet, to the more predictable, like cyclones and trying to resolve fights with your missus in the confines of a 40-foot vessel. I must say the downsides were substantially outweighed by the upsides. The unlimited pleasures of waking up each day in one of the most beautiful, pristine and remote areas of Australia. Imagine it if you can. Emerald-coloured rainforests that just come down to a crystal clear cobalt sea. Just a glorious place to work and a glorious place to live. As a conservationist and a fisherman, I've developed and maintained a keen interest in the use and controls of our natural resources. I'm the immediate past chairman of the Australian Seafood Industry Council, one of the largest conservation groups in Australia, the work of which I have no doubt is well known to the members of the chamber. Now, I can remember, as perhaps many other people in the chamber will, as a young bloke, environmentally friendly meant putting the cigarette butt out in the beer can before you threw it out of the window. In the past, we had followed what we considered to be the world's best practice. We were encouraged to cut down those ugly native trees, and we were encouraged to plant wheat and other European crops. We treated fisheries as if they were a danger to swimming. Bigger vessels, more capacities, cried the experts. Australia now understands that the worst aspects of environmental degradation in this country, evidenced by dryland salinity, degraded rivers, depleted fish stocks and a net loss to our biodiversity, they are the result of our own historical world's best practice. I have noticed with growing concern the call for primary producers just to stop these practices overnight. Fisherfolk, lay down your lines. Irrigators, just give up your water quota. Graziers, clear no more land. but without consideration for compensation. If we ask the food producers of Australia to repair 50 years of our bad management and our bad advice without adjustment packages, and that means compensation, then we're asking for the job not to be done. I was delighted that His Excellency the Governor-General highlighted and reflected Australians' concerns about the environment in his speech yesterday. The establishment of a new Sustainable Environment Committee of Cabinet, chaired by the Prime Minister, will most certainly place this most important of issues under the strongest focus of government. As part of the Seafood Industry Council's role in protecting our natural resources, it lobbied the federal government to take a strong stance in regard to protecting our sovereign resources in the Great Southern Oceans. I'm delighted to report that this government now has a policy that sends a clear message to those who come to Australian waters with the intent of stealing our fisheries resources. If you come to steal, we are prepared. You will be caught, you will be prosecuted, and it is very likely you will lose your vessel and your equipment. This is a strong policy that has resulted in a substantial decline in the number of recidivist illegal fishers. In an international sense, Australia has been a leader in the high seas fishing agreements and is widely respected for its strong position on maximising the benefits to Australia over the sustainable use of our marine resources. Unfortunately, it seems that our policies in regard to our offshore oil and gas reserves do not enjoy the same focus of putting Australia first. Recent discussions with representatives of the oil and gas industry reveal that serious consideration is being given to constructing a floating liquid natural gas plant over the Bayu Undan gas field north of Darwin. Now, this has actually been proposed as an alternative to bringing natural gas onshore to be processed in Darwin and connecting Australia with cheap, efficient power. So instead of creating jobs and an economic stimulus in the Northern Territory in Australia, these jobs will be created instead in Korean shipyards, and another nation will enjoy the economic benefits that are necessarily associated with the construction of liquid natural gas production plants. You'd have to agree, clearly this is not in our national interest. Processing the gas offshore and having gas loaded into ships destined for overseas markets gives the impression that Australia has an unlimited supply of gas, or that there is little domestic demand for this commodity. Well, we all know that's not the case. What legacy shall we leave our children? Will they live in a truly independent country? Independent, not to rely on another? Or will we leave our children with a country that relies on other nations for its power supply? Or instead, will we leave them with a country that has access to affordable power and enjoys the jobs, the economic stability and the security that comes with industries that thrive on affordable power? Every endeavour must be made to ensure that if multinational companies wish to profit from our natural resources, they must accept that future use of extracted resources be managed in a way that maximises the long-term interests of all Australians. I will continue to work with this government to ensure that the resources that lie to the north of my beloved territory are extracted in a way that achieves this outcome. I have also been closely associated with the issue of sea rights, and in fact I am one of the principal respondents to the Croker Island test case of native title overseas. We entered this process willingly and will accept the determination of the court in this matter. Aboriginal land under inalienable freehold title comprises 84% of the Northern Territory coastline, virtually all of the rest of the coastline under land claim. Almost the entire area of the intertidal zone of the Northern Territory, in some cases stretching over 1 kilometre to seaward, is also under claim. My principal concern is that if these claims are granted, the fish stocks that live or move through these waters will no longer enjoy the protection offered under our fisheries legislation, thus enabling new owners to issue additional access rights, which will inevitably place extra pressure on our currently well-managed fish stocks. Depletion of fish stocks, particularly in breeding areas, will lead to depletion in other areas. You just can't take the plug out of one end of the bath and expect the water to remain in the other. Much of my time in the Territory have been spent on land that belongs to Aboriginal people and on waters adjacent to that land. Indeed, the times my wife and I value most are those spent with our only neighbours at the time, the Aboriginal people that inhabit their lands and islands along the Arnhem Land coast. It still amazes me that in the Territory you can drive for days in a vessel through myriads of the most magnificent islands, or for countless hours across countries so rich, not only in a cultural sense, but also in an economic sense, with such potential for industries, tourism, aquaculture and forestry. And yet when you arrive at the home of the proud owners of these vast, rich tracts of land, you're not greeted, as you may well expect, by a community whose housing, health and economic well-being reflect the richness of their land. Instead, dwellings sometimes consist of a few sheets of tin. The overall community demonstrates the lowest standards of mainstream education, the lowest standards of health, and an average life expectancy for men which is less than my current age. Now, I don't stand before you claiming that I've got the answers to this most complex challenge. In fact, if you ever get a phone call from somebody who claims to have the answer to the challenges facing Indigenous Australia, just hang up. And whilst I'm sure that the social debris from the collision between Stone Age culture and modern times is not going to be cleaned up through implementing just one or two ideas, I suspect that the special Aboriginal freehold title issued to Indigenous Territorians under the current legislation is a sad comparison with real freehold title enjoyed by other Australians. The nature of the tenure of this land is a principal impediment to development and the economic self-determination that will surely follow. Residents of our 6 states may not be familiar with legislation that gives rise to such discrimination against Indigenous Territorians in relation to their land, that provides for massive sea and river closures, then that dramatically reduces our capacity to manage the marine environment in a sustainable manner. This is because the Northern Territory is the only jurisdiction that is affected by such legislation, and that legislation is, of course, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, Northern Territory 1976. Since the introduction of native title, the Northern Territory now has a double whammy. We have 2 Commonwealth Acts dealing essentially with the same issues. If a single Commonwealth Act is good enough for the rest of Australia, then it should be good enough for the Northern Territory. I'll be calling on members of this House to support Territorians in amendments to the Aboriginal Land Rights Act that may be brought forward to make it consistent with native title. I strongly believe that appropriate amendments will deliver not only a secure and sustainable economic future for all Territorians, but also the capacity for genuine self-determination for Indigenous Territorians. The Aboriginal Land Act is an ill-considered piece of legislation that became law in the Northern Territory in 1976 because Territorians had no choice in the matter. Madam President, the people of the Northern Territory are regularly reminded of the fact that we often have little input in determining our own future. A stark example was the euthanasia debate, Territorians' very mature attempt to resolve the most complex of social issues, was treated with contempt, and our decisions were overturned as if we were errant children. This is the sort of reminder that keeps the vision of statehood and the struggle for self-determination fresh in the minds of Territorians. I was very pleased to hear His Excellency the Governor-General reflect the government's position that Australian society is fundamentally built upon the principles of fairness and equity. I'm delighted to report to His Excellency that statehood is again the focus of discussion in the Northern Territory, and I will be working with all levels of government to ensure that the principles of fairness and equity are applied to all Territorians as we take our legitimate place in the Federation as the state of the Northern Territory. Madam President, at some time during the escalation of hostilities in East Timor, prior to that young nation's independence, my eldest son Daniel sidled up to me and he stood quite close. He was silent for a moment, in which Dan's case it usually prefaces a statement of some great import or he's broken something. And he said, "Dad," he said, "when the war comes here, will I have to fight?" And I assured him that there would be no war in Darwin and he wouldn't have to fight anyway. I also reminded him that the last time Australia was attacked was 60 years ago when Darwin was bombed. We then spoke for a while about how lucky we are. about how Australia, in comparison with the rest of the world, is a hostility-free country. Dan's concerns were also a reminder that whilst Darwin is the capital of the Northern Territory, it is also an Australian capital in Southeast Asia. In such turbulent times, I see much wisdom in the words of a great Australian and Territorian, the late Reverend Fred Mackay, who suggested in effect that we should view tolerance and forgiveness as greatness. If these words were to become the mantra of all Australians, our beloved island home will remain free for another 60 years of the sort of hostilities that have tormented so many other nations of the world. I will work with the members of this chamber to ensure that our legacy to the children of Australia is at least equal in quality to the social, economic and environmental legacy that previous generations of Australians have bequeathed to us. Madam Speaker, I have always felt a little sad for all those Australians who have not made the Northern Territory their home, and in the interest of fairness and equity, I invite the members of the Senate to visit the Territory at any time, and when you're there, experience a new benchmark in hospitality, and in your memories at least, take home a slice of paradise.